for the final session here, we have a really special topic that I am super passionate about. It's just one of the core parts for me, for the ministry that we're doing. This is just a foundational thing. We're specifically going to talk about the persecuted church and the ministry involved in that here in this last section. I always try to bring this topic up whenever I teach or this is our first workshop, but as we continue doing workshops and courses and those kinds of things, the persecuted church is always going to be one of the themes in there because it is a subject that is very rarely talked about. And even whenever it comes to missions, even whenever it comes to training schools, all of those things, you rarely hear about this aspect of the persecuted church. And it is such an important part of our ministry because we don't realize just how forgotten huge parts of the church are, just how much they're suffering, how much need there is, and we have an opportunity to take part in helping them. At the very least, pray for them. But the thing is we need to have the knowledge of what's going on, because most of the time we have no idea. And this is what, whenever I start talking about this, sometimes people get frustrated and they say, they get mad at the church. They get mad, especially like the Western church. They say, the churches, they're not doing their job. They're not doing this, and, they should be more involved. But the fact is that most of the church, a large percent of the church, has no idea about the things I'm about to present to you. They have no clue. It's a completely foreign concept to them. So this is why I always try to bring this up, because the Bible says, and I'll read the whole verse later, but the Bible says, Paul, whenever he was writing, he said, remember my bonds whenever he was in prison. Remember my chains. And that's what I try to do. I try to remind the believers here to remember the chains of those who are in chains for the sake of Christ, because it isn't just something that happened back in the Old Testament. It's something that's happening. It is something that is alive and well today, and it's a terrible thing. But we as brothers and sisters of those same people, we need to be aware of this. I'm sure most of you have probably heard on the news, there's a lot of talk about Saeed Abedini. He's one guy out of tens of thousands who are going through something similar or who have been through it. And it's a great thing that this has come to light. But, it's great that they're trying to get him out. But there, right next to him, I assure you, there are probably dozens of Christians in that same prison with him probably, who nobody knows about. So that's what I want to talk about. If you can bring up the next one, please. You can go to the next. Just press the arrow on. All right, no, go back one. There you go. Okay, just do one at a time. So, July 2013. These two girls here, this is a picture that was taken in Pakistan back in July. These are two young girls who had just converted to Christianity. All right? They converted to Christianity and they were given these books. The book was called The Story of Jesus in their native language, which is Urdu. And they were, as you can see, they're happy, they're excited. Just became Christians. And they were there as part of this ministry. And then 2 months later, on a Sunday morning, they were in church. They had just gotten born again. They were in church. And two suicide bombers walked in, blew up their vests, and these two girls died in that incident just because they had become Christians. Aside from these two girls, there were 78 other people who were killed in that bomb attack against Christians. And another 130 were injured. Next slide. This is January. This picture, the event that took place in this picture was from January 10th, 2014. So we're just talking a few weeks ago. The man there, his name was Pastor. He's a pastor of a church in New Delhi, India. His name is Pastor Sanjeevi. And he was at home just doing his thing. He was with his family. And a group of Hindu extremists came and began knocking on their door, saying that they wanted to pray with him. His wife came and opened the door. Remember, this is just a few weeks ago. All right, this isn't something far away. His wife came to the door, the woman right there, because the Hindu extremists said that they wanted to pray with him. She came to the door and they knocked her over the head with an iron rod. knocked her to the ground, and they all rushed in, and they beat him and stabbed him multiple times in front of his children and his wife. And she managed to get out and call for help, and they all ran away, leaving him there unconscious on the floor. They tried to save him, but just a few days later, he died from his injuries. The reason why they attacked him was because they were angry at the growth of Christianity in the area, of which he had a great part. He was an active Christian in his area, and he paid the ultimate price for it. You can go on the next. In Bor, Sudan, this is a picture that was taken February 10th, 2014, so 5 days ago. All right? On February 10th, 2014, well, actually, this started December 15th. What happened was there was a rebel group in Sudan called the White Army. And they are a group of, now you remember Renaud was talking about 10% are the extremists, okay? So we're not saying all Muslims are this way. But this particular group is a group of extremist Muslims that targeted churches in this part of Sudan, but specifically targeted female Christians. In particular, women pastors. They had such an issue that on December 15th, they began to just go through this army of rebel groups. They just started going through these different villages, and you can see here in this picture is just the ruins of what's left over. And they began to rape and to murder. They killed 5 women pastors of small churches there in Sudan. And since December 15th of last 2013 up until now, more than 2,500 Christian women in this area have been killed just for being Christians. It's the only reason. On to the next one. This picture is from February 2nd, 2014. Less than 2 weeks ago. I mean, just not long ago, right? There was a pastor. His name was Pastor Lawrence. And what was happening was there were different people who kept invading their church. They kept stealing from the church. So he decided that he was going to sleep in the church to protect it. Not the best idea. But the problem is in areas like Kenya, parts of Africa, different parts of the world, Christians don't have the same rights that you do here. Like here, if you had people coming into this church or whatever church you're from, and they're stealing stuff, you call the police will deal with it. They'll arrest the people, they'll set up guards, or whatever it is they have to do. Not so in Muslim nations. In Muslim nations, what you end up with is the police say, it's your problem, you deal with it. You brought this on yourself. I saw this personally whenever I lived in Turkey. I tell this story all the time because it's really funny to me, but it's true. We were in a youth group service, and we had a little youth group there in Turkey, and we get a phone call. The police on the line. They tell us there's a bomb in your church, and they say, there's a bomb in your church, but you shouldn't go outside because there are probably people waiting out there to kill you all. And we're sitting there on the phone with the police, and we say, well, shouldn't you come get the bomb or help us or something? And they said, we're not going anywhere near there because we're not going to die for you. So I'm actually me and our other missionary leaders are actually going through the church, the little building we met in, looking for a bomb. We didn't ever find anything. It was probably a false threat, but that is the kind of treatment you get in those kind of nations if you're a Christian. It's your problem. Now they'll wait, like you see, these are officials here. They'll wait until the damage is done and then come in and take a bunch of pictures of themselves putting out the fires so that they can say, we support human rights and all that. But it's all just a cover. It's fake. So he decided to protect his church, and while he's there sleeping, 2 men came in, robbed the church, and killed him. And they ran off. So we can go on next. Colossians 4:8. Remember my bonds, or remember my chains in other versions. This picture right here is from March 9th, 2013. This is one of the most horrendous attacks that, they happen all the time, but this one really touched me. This happened in Pakistan. There were 2 men. there was a Muslim man and a Christian man, and they worked together in the same factory, and they were friends and they were close, but the Christian man was too scared to ever share his faith with the Muslim man because of fear. Now, this is amazing to me because so many Muslims, just like Renaud was speaking about, it is so true. We learned when we were in Turkey, the majority of people who get saved, it's from the Word of God, but so much of it is they have these visions and dreams that he mentioned. And it's usually not that they get saved from that particular vision. Usually what would happen would be Jesus would appear to them in a dream or a vision, and it's so amazing. Jesus wouldn't present the gospel to them. This happened to us over and over again. Jesus would appear, and they'd say, "Who are you?" Kind of like Saul, "Who are you, Lord?" And he would say, "I'm Jesus. Now I want you to go," and he would give them an address. He said, "I want you to go to this place, tell them you saw me, and tell them to tell you what the truth about life is." And they would go, and it would be to our house or, an apartment or a church office or whatever. And they'd walk in, no idea what it is. They just have a dream, and they'd walk in and say, "This guy named Jesus appeared in a dream to me, and he says I'm supposed to come to you to hear what the truth is." And then they would come to Christ because we would share with them. That's how they would come to the Lord. And so often, and I believe that a lot of times the reason why this happens, and that is including here, I'm not talking about just in the Middle East. A lot of times God brings Muslims to Him through dreams and visions because the Christians are too scared to actually step out and talk to them. Renaud talked about this. So many times, it's all about just being friendly. Not just with Muslims either. We're talking Hindus, Buddhists, atheists, it doesn't matter. It's so many times God has to divinely intervene into a life because Christians are often too scared to do what God has called us to do. Now, in this particular picture, the Christian man, he hadn't told the Muslim man about his faith. And one day, he decided, all right, I'm going to share what I believe about Jesus. Because they had been friends for years. They had worked side by side in this factory for years. And so the Christian man, finally, he looks at the Muslim man and he says, I believe in Jesus, blah, blah, blah. He explains, he goes through the whole thing. And the Muslim man, in this particular case, did not react the way we would hope. Instead, he went to some of the local extremist groups of which he was a part. And he said there is a man who has abandoned the faith and he deserves to die. And it's because of the great Christian influence that is in our area here in Pakistan. So what ended up happening was, they gathered a group of 3,000 fanatics, extremists. And they gathered together, and the next morning they went house to house and burned down 175 homes throughout this part of Pakistan. And you can see the results of one of the houses that was completely destroyed here. And it was just incredible the amount of damage that was done. The Christian man, he ended up going to prison. As far as I know, he's still there now. We don't know. Around the world, Christians are suffering persecution. Most of the time, like I said, we don't know anything about it. The Western church is often criticized because they don't know. And also because in many nations, the Western churches have been deceived by closed nations. Now, Renaud mentioned like Saudi Arabia is a closed nation. It's a nation that a Christian cannot freely enter into. Oftentimes, what happens, let's take China for example. Often the United Nations, United States government, these different kinds of governments, oftentimes will agree, hey, there's freedom of religion in China. They'll say this because in China, you can go to China. You can actually go to China and go into a Christian church. They have open church buildings. But you see, if you speak to underground churches, like there's a book, Tortured for Christ, you can get. There's all kinds of different books about people who live in underground churches. And they will tell you that these churches are usually government planted. The government plants the church, and they have actual communists who they place as the pastors of these different churches. This is so that they can control the movement of Christianity in the nation. It's amazing. You know, China is one of the largest producers of Bibles in the world, but you can't go and legally purchase a Bible in China. So there are often, and this is something I've been a part of, and Kingdom Fire will be getting into this soon, I'm sure. But personally, I've been a part of buying Bibles for Chinese pastors for a while, a long time, because they will have all these, I don't know if you've heard of old Bible smuggling stories. We seem to think that that's all done, but that still goes on every day. Every day there are thousands of Bibles being smuggled into China because they have, like I mentioned earlier this morning, 10,000 Chinese coming to Christ every single day. They don't have Bibles. All right, they've got 1,000 people with a single Bible in the entire congregation. They have to rip out all the pages of the Bible, not in a bad way. They rip out each page carefully, and each member of the congregation will get one page, and that's what they get. They have to read it, memorize it as best they can, and then they switch out. And that's that one Bible that they have among all of them. So we make it our goal, not just us, but there's other ministries. Some of the information I'm about to give you comes from a ministry called Christians in Crisis. Awesome ministry, the Voice of the Martyrs. These are ministries that specialize and focus on helping Christians in persecuted nations. They bring in Bibles. I wanted to bring some materials to show you, but as I was looking for it, I realized I left it all in Panama, so I couldn't show these to you. But I've got amazing materials that you would just... The amount of creativity that goes into reaching these kinds of places is absolutely amazing. There's one particular... I was good friends with the director, or still am, I should say, with the director of the Voice of the Martyrs in Central America, and he lives in Costa Rica. I'd go visit him, and he'd teach in our training schools, and he would go with helicopters over rebel groups in the jungles of Central America, specifically in Colombia. He would fly over, and he had these crates that were full of Bibles, but they weren't just any Bible. They were the coolest Bibles you can imagine. They looked and felt, they were a little bit heavier than a regular Bible, but they looked and felt just like it, but it was all plastic. 100% plastic Bible, but it looked like a real Bible, like it was paper. And so they would go and drop these crates of Bibles all over the jungles, into the rivers where these rebel groups are. And rebels were coming out, finding these crates, open up, and finding them full of Bibles and getting saved through the Word of God. Another thing that's so cool, I'm going to spend a significant amount of time on North Korea here in this last part. But North Korea, because they are the most closed nation to the gospel in the entire world right now. They are the most difficult nation to get into. And so they've been trying to figure out, how can we get the gospel into a place where it's virtually impossible to get into. So they've come up with, it's amazing the creativity that God has. They will go up to the border of South Korea, because South Korea is predominantly Christian. It is majority Christian, South Korea is. One of the largest senders of missionaries on the planet is South Korea. You go on the mission field, there's Koreans pretty much everywhere you go. They're awesome. And so these South Koreans and missions organizations, they will go up right to the border of North Korea. And they're right there, and as they're there on the border, they've got these crazy balloons. And it's got the entire book of Mark in Korean. And it's all this, it's kind of a thick plastic, and it's got a little hole in the bottom, just a small little hole, and they'll fill it up with helium. And it's the science. There's a lot of science and fancy stuff behind this. They study wind patterns and movement and the weather and all this weird stuff. And they wait until it's just right, and they fill up thousands of these balloons and launch them all into the air, and the wind just blows them all into North Korea. And that little hole at the bottom slowly releases the helium, and they just slowly fall all over the nation of North Korea. And there was one old woman, this elderly woman I should call her, this elderly woman who had spent her life asking God who He was. She didn't know who God was, never had the opportunity, but she knew there was a God, because every human being, whether they admit it or not, in their spirit, they know that there is a God. They know there's something beyond them. And so this woman had spent her whole life asking, God, I know You exist, but who are You? I know You exist. And she was walking through the park. It was a rainy day, And she was walking through the park, and there in the ground, and halfway in a puddle of mud, was this big orange piece of trash. And she picked it up, and it was the book of Mark in one of these balloons. And she read it, and of course, it's North Korea, so you can't just go, hey, it's the Bible. No, she hid it, went home, and read it. And she fell on her knees afterwards. She said, thank you, God, for finally showing me who you are. The only reason we know this story is because she eventually was smuggled out of the country. But there's just so many stories like this of these. Once we start moving into these kinds of ministries as Kingdom Fire, you won't ever hear us talk about it, because these are completely closed nations. You cannot just openly speak about it. All right? But these are nations where Christians are living in caves, they're living in fields, they're living lives that you cannot imagine. And yet it's just absolutely amazing what God is doing through them. All right, let's go on to the next slide. Since the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago, 43 million Christians have become martyrs. Over 50% of these were just in the last century. So you can see there's an acceleration going on. Each day, more than 200 million Christians face persecution. 60% of those are children. Every day, more than 300 Christians are martyred for their faith in Jesus. Now, let's go back to that for a minute. Every day, more than 300 Christians are martyred. To be martyred means to die for something. They are killed for their faith in Jesus. There's a story, you see up there it says 60% are children. There's a story about a little girl. She was in school in a certain communist country, and a group of military police came in, and they heard that someone had a Bible. Because what often happens is that in the schools, the teachers are taught to ask the children who go to these government schools, if their parents read any foreign literature, if their parents sing any foreign songs. And there was one little girl. She's a little girl. She doesn't know any different. Through her, they found out that their parents she had a Bible, and she had happened to bring it to school on the day that these police came in. The police came in, went over to where she was, found the Bible, and they threw it on the ground and began to spit on it. And this little girl, maybe 10 years old, runs up to the front and falls on her knees in front of the Bible and picked it up and started to wipe off all the spit with her dress. And she said, "Oh, Jesus, they're spitting on your word. How can they do this?" And this is recent history, okay? And the police looked at her and they just took out a gun and shot her in the head right there in the middle of class. These are things that happen every single day. It's not just a Muslim thing. It happens in Hindu countries. It happens in Buddhist countries. It happens in Catholic countries. Southern Mexico, Chiapas, Mexico. There are tens of thousands of Christians who are homeless right now because the Catholic Church there, they have these festivals where everyone gets drunk, and everyone has to pay a tax to fund these things. This is just like the big fight that's going on right now, the big legal thing with Hobby Lobby in different places where they're not wanting to pay for abortion to happen. This has been going on in Mexico for hundreds of years, I should say, maybe, where the Catholics are saying you have to pay a tax, and that tax is going to go to pay for this big drunken party we're going to have to worship all these saints. And the Christians refuse to pay it. So the government, in retaliation, cuts off their water, cuts off their electricity, kicks them out of the villages, and they just become these outcasts with their family. And there are right now people living in Mexico like that, where they have nothing. Northern Guatemala, whenever I was there, I spent a couple months there, and we were right at the border of Mexico. They took us to a village where we could not go any further. I wanted to go further. We went and preached, and they said, "You guys are lucky," because we got to go to this village and preach and nothing happened. They told us, "You guys are lucky because the last people that came to this place to try and preach the gospel, a group of men came out with machetes and drove them all out, threatening to kill everyone." These are places just hop on a plane and you're there in a couple hours. All right, these are not far away places, and this is not something in the past. This is today happening. Orissa, India. Recently, this was a few years ago now, but in Orissa, India, on Christmas Day a few years ago, a group of Muslims came, not Muslims, Hindus came, and killed and or forced to leave their homes over 70,000 people. And they are still recovering from that. It was just a slaughter that people, these guys, these Hindu extremists just came through and just started killing everyone. Only because Orissa was a predominantly Christian city. In Indonesia, between 2000 and 2002, over 10,000 Christians were killed because of their faith. During the 70 years of Russian communism, more than 20 million Christians were killed. All right, let's continue. Now, the majority of this, I know we've already talked about this area, but the 1040 window, most of the persecution that's going on is happening in those parts of the world. Now, that is not the only place. Because like I mentioned, in Turkey, in Mexico, and northern Guatemala, even in Panama. Panama is one of the most peaceful countries that you can go to as a Christian. It is awesome. It is Costa Rica as well. But you go far enough into those mountains where the gospel has never been preached. I personally am friends with a guy. He decided to take the big challenge of, I'm going to go onto that mountain range where nobody's ever gone before. He decided to take that challenge. So he walked those mountain ranges and he found a group of people. They have a religion called Mama Tata, and it is a mixture of Catholicism and witchcraft, but old Catholicism back when Cortez came and he invaded. I mean, this is something, they don't know white people, all right? They've never seen anybody that is other than Latino color, okay? So he goes out there, Mama Tata, they build these big giant crosses, and some guy stands on top of the cross and he preaches, and and they think he's God, and all kinds of they believe all kinds of weird stuff. And he went out there and he decided to preach to them about Jesus. They needed to repent and come to Jesus. Well, they didn't like that very much, and so they took him. They actually tied him to a pole, to like a cross kind of thing, and they put weights on his shoulders and made him kneel on dried up corn cobs for an entire night. And then they put weights on his legs as well. Now, I don't know if you've ever had to do that. That is extremely painful. Old dried up corn cobs on your knees, an entire night with weights on you, that is extremely painful. All right, he was there for a full night, and he still has problems with his legs since then because they swelled up so much and the damage was so extensive. And that was his experience. And as far as I know, he never went back. They let him go, and I don't think he ever went back again. So the top nations for persecution in the world. I'm just going to give you the top 5 lists, and then we're going to go into talking about North Korea. Number 1 is North Korea. Number 2, most persecuted nation, Saudi Arabia. Number 3 is Afghanistan. Number 4 is Iraq, and number 5 is Somalia. All right, so let's move on. Oh, well, there it is. You can just bring that up. Okay, I want to talk about North Korea. Now, these slides, as you can see here on the bottom, they are from the North Korea Freedom Coalition. A lot of these slides that you see, they were taken at great risk to certain people. That's why you'll notice that some of them are not great quality, but they give us a really good view of what's going on there. And I just want to highlight this because it is an example of what is going on around the world. North Korea, it says the land of darkness. You'll see here in this area is South Korea. You see it's all lit up. This is just like a view of the light. And then North Korea is this big dark space right here with that one little dot there from their capital. So for North Korea, as I said, for the last 10 years has been ranked the number 1 nation for persecution in the world. There are currently estimated, as I said, this is a closed nation, highly difficult to get into. It is really hard to gauge with complete accuracy what's going on there. There's only a few people who have snuck in, or people who've been smuggled out that have been able to get us this information. But it is estimated that between 50 and 70,000 Christians are in labor camps right now because of their beliefs. Since 2003, if you can go on to the next slide. Since 2003, it's reported that 42% of all North Korean children suffer from chronic malnutrition, which is why North Koreans tend to be much shorter than South Koreans, because they don't have enough nutrition. As you can also see, the government there only allows government channels in North Korea. All radios and television sets are fixed to a few select government channels, and their users are required to be registered. Can you imagine that? If you had to register to watch TV, you know, you want to watch the news and they all knew what you were watching. Can you go on to the next slide, please? Humanitarian relief experts report more than 4 million North Koreans have died of starvation since 1995. That is probably much higher by now. It's amazing. It says that the food crisis continues to dominate. I think there's a... Let's go on to the next slide. Let's see if you can go past that one. Yeah, the government wants to control entire classes of people, suppress those of opposing viewpoints, and stop anyone known to have religious beliefs. See, a lot of this stuff is completely founded in fear of change. There is such a fear of an uprising from the Korean government. They put on such a show that they don't want anybody to realize the truth of what's going on. There's one particular slide I'm waiting for. If you can see if we can find. There it is. Okay. This is a daily ration of food in North Korea. Most people, if they don't have their own land, if they can't grow crops, which is rare, this is what they get, 100 grams of broken corn. I know, I can't go into detail on it. There is an organization that works regularly in North Korea, and they're there and they're giving out. It is amazing the deal they have with the government right now, because the government is so tight with food, in the sense of, it's not that the government doesn't want to give food to their people, it's that there's no food to go around because the government is cut off. North Korea is cut off from most other government. People won't deal with them because they have some crazy leaders. So they do allow other organizations to go in, missionary organizations to go in undercover. They don't go in saying, we're a Christian organization here to evangelize the people. They just go in and say, we want to help. So there are certain organizations that they are feeding tens of thousands of North Koreans every single day in secret. Nobody on the outside knows about it. There are just a few people who are involved. The only reason I know about it is just because of my training in frontier missions, the involvement that I have with people who do that kind of stuff. That's the only reason I know about it. They're just feeding the starvation that is going on in that nation. The amount of people who are so broken, they have absolutely nothing. And they have no hope for change. They don't even know there is a difference. They don't know that there's a different kind of lifestyle. For them to be able to come to a place like this would just, they would think that this is heaven. To them, how is this even possible? Because they cannot imagine a different kind of lifestyle. I'm going to tell you a story in a few minutes here that is just absolutely amazing. Let's continue. You can see here, there are homeless children everywhere. The reason why there's so many homeless people in North Korea is because so many parents are executed for the tiniest crimes. Go on to the next one. You can see there the background. You see the way the cities and the nation has just become this destitute, continuously, it just is a big giant ruin. They have no power, they put on this big show, and they look great on TV when you see, when they show the president guy. But this is the reality of the majority of their nation, is brokenness, starvation, orphans, and just anyone who wants to help is constantly under surveillance. I have a friend who went to North Korea. He was able to get in, and he said he was able to get in as more of a tourist. He was like a businessman who was just going on tour. And he said that when he was there, it was illegal. They told him when he arrived, it was illegal for a North Korean to speak to him at all, to say hi to him. And so he would walk down the roads, and people would just scatter from him, because if they were to so much as make eye contact, they could be executed. The government has such tight control on their people. Let's move on to the next slide, please. There was a little boy his name was Jil-soo. He was 15 years old. He escaped from North Korea. Like I said, I'll tell you a story here in a minute. Escape from North Korea is like the dream. That is the American dream in North Korea, is to escape and find a better life. This little boy, he escaped and he drew pictures of his life there. And this is a common story. I've heard this over and over again. He said, we all became grass eaters. Food is so scarce there that the only way they survive is by gathering grass, and they make soups and they eat it. Okay? Next slide. This same guy, Jil-soo, he also drew this, and he talks about how North Korean military police kill for no reason except just to create a climate of terror. All they want is control, because the government itself is terrified of change, and so they create terror. On to the next slide. This is another, can you imagine, this is a 15-year-old kid who drew this, all right? He talked about public and secret executions. This is just something, I mean, can you imagine a teenager and this is what he drew. Next slide. If one family member is caught in a crime as small as singing a foreign song, possessing any religious literature, stealing food to survive, or trying to escape North Korea, the entire family, including grandparents and little children, are taken to death camps where they usually die from hard labor, starvation, or execution. And this is just an image that was taken from the U.S. Committee of Human Rights. This is where the different death camps are, the labor camps are, where they take people. They work until they're no longer productive, and then they're killed, and their bodies are disposed of secretly. You can see they've got them all over the nation, and they're just, like I said earlier, about roughly 50,000 Christians are in those camps right now. Families must choose to stay, or whole families attempt to swim across the river. Basically, they have to try and escape, or they just die, because they just live in complete suffering. There is a river called the Tumen River, and whether it's North Korean guards or the Chinese guards, because many of them, they try to escape into China, because they think China is such a big place, surely they will find freedom there. And they end up you see there's a body floating in that river. That is someone who tried to make it, and they were shot down trying to swim across that river. But what they end up finding, go on to the next slide, is that whenever they get into China expecting to find refuge, instead they are completely rejected by the Chinese people. They're outcasts, and if the Chinese government finds them, they will ship them back to North Korea. So what they end up doing is they end up living in the garbage dumps, surviving, just foraging for food in the dumps, which probably for many of them is a better life than they even had in North Korea. But it seems like no matter where they go, they end up suffering. As a matter of fact, 70% of North Korean women who actually make it into China end up becoming prostitutes and sex slaves. They end up being trafficked. They're sent out of the country. They're sent to other parts of the world because who's going to help them? The Chinese government isn't going to help them. And if they go back to North Korea, they're going to go to prison in a camp. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to stop on this picture for a little bit. This picture so intrigued me that I had to look up what happened here. You'll see here it says 2-year-old Han Mi cries as her mother is stopped by Chinese police. Absolutely amazing, this story to me. I want to tell you what happened here. This family, Han Mi's family, that's the little girl you see crying, Han Mi. They lived in North Korea, and they wanted to get out. All right? So they planned this whole escape, this dramatic, escape, and they make this plan, right? And they tried to escape. They made it all the way to the border, right? They made it, and they thought they were going to be free, but instead they were caught right as they made it to the Chinese border, thinking, we're going to be free. They get caught in China and got sent to prison. Now, because of Han Mi, this little girl had the grace of God on her life. Because of this little girl, the mother and her were allowed to go free. They were allowed to go back home. But the father, he was sent to one of these labor camps. And he was sent to the labor camp, and they worked him, and they worked him, and they worked him, until he got so weak that he couldn't work anymore. And they planned his execution. They said that they were going to kill him. But what they decided to do, and this is the weirdest thing to me, they had to take him into the little clinic that they had in the labor camp because he was getting so weak. And when he's there, they're trying to revive him enough to execute him. Because of the human, I don't know, they don't want that whole outcry if they executed a sick man or something. They wanted to be able to pin some kind of crime on him. But he heard the guards saying, once he's able to walk again, once he's strong enough, we're going to execute him. So he went on a hunger strike and refused to eat anything. And he just got weaker and weaker and weaker. And it got to the point where the soldiers there in the little clinic, they couldn't keep him alive. And so they said, the only choice we have is to send him to the main government hospital in the capital city. So that's what they did. In order to revive him enough to execute him, they sent him to the main hospital. And he got there and started to recover. And once he was well enough, he escaped. He managed to get out of the hospital and escape. He runs across all these fields and he travels, and he made it back home to where his wife and his daughter was. And because he was being searched for and under surveillance, they dug a hole under the table, under the rug, and he lived in that hole under their house for months as they plotted their next escape. Finally, the day comes, they find their chance, he gets out of his hole, and they run for it. They make it all the way to China. They actually go across the river, they escape, make it into China, and all of a sudden they find out, oh no, this is not what we were expecting. There's nowhere for us to go, and there's no help for us. We're lost forever. And God, it's just amazing, the grace of God, put them in contact with people who just happen to have an organization that helps North Korean refugees find a better place. But see, these people, they find North Koreans in China, and they say, China is not going to help you. You need to go to South Korea. The problem is, though, is that to get to South Korea, you've got to go back through North Korea. And so what they decided was, as they're talking to this organization, what can we do? So many North Koreans try to get to South Korea that the South Korean embassy in China is guarded by Chinese soldiers 24/7. They could not get to the South Korean embassy for help. So they ended up deciding, they searched around who could help them, and it was decided, because they discovered that the Japanese embassy happened to keep their gate halfway open throughout the day. And they're looking, and there's only 2 Chinese guards circling the Japanese embassy. And they thought, if we can just get through that gate, we'll be home free. And so Hanmi, her mother, her father, and 2 other guys, they sneak through China, get to the embassy, and they see the gate, and it's open. All they have to do is run through it. And as far as they're concerned, they're free, because now they're on Japanese territory. And so they all just make a break for it. They run, and the Chinese guards that you see in that picture there see them. And the 2 guys, being faster, made it through the gate. The 3 guys, they all made it through the gate and ran straight into the embassy, leaving the mother and the daughter there, including the husband. He went in too. And Hanmi made it to the other side, but the mother got stuck at the gate. They caught her right at the gate and dragged her away. And eventually, see, this is where if they had just done that, if they had just taken the mother and left the others, there would have been no problem. They would have shipped her back to North Korea, and she probably would have been executed. But because of the anger that the Chinese guards had, they actually grabbed her, put her under arrest, and they charged inside the Japanese embassy and dragged the guys out, and Hanmi as well. And the Japanese government, they have these cameras that are showing video constantly. And this was broadcast. This eventually was broadcast all over Japan. And the headlines in the news in Japan was, China invades Japanese territory. It was made as this sort of a war declaration. They went into our embassy and took people that they had no right to take. And so these Hanmi, everyone, they were put into a Chinese prison. And they were trying to figure out what to do. They wanted to send them back to North Korea. But the Japanese government was so angry that they would dare to invade their property that they said, if you don't want war between us, you will give us those people. They said that's the only ways you can appease us, is if you give us back all of those North Koreans who wanted to come onto our... They made it. You had no right to take them. And it took about a week or two, but finally, in order to avoid this huge conflict, China gave Hanmi and her family to the Japanese embassy, and the Japanese embassy escorted them to South Korea. And you can put on the next slide. And this is Hanmi. This is a couple years ago now. This is Hanmi and her family now, living in South Korea. They're safe, and what they do now they have become part of those organizations that helps North Koreans start new lives in South Korea. So, families are forced to return, interrogated. We've already mentioned that. And then we're going to stop right here. You can light a candle in the darkness. Now, North Korea, I focused on that today because just to give you that is one nation. It is the most persecuted nation, but those are by no means just... Hanmi's story is not just this random story. These are things that happen every single day. As you've been here in this workshop today, dozens and dozens of Christians have died and have been put in prison because they're Christians. We need to know that. You may not be called to go yourself. You may not be called to go into the Dalit people group and start churches and risk your life. But at the very least, you need to pray for these different people. Now I'm going to call up our Stephen. He's part of the Kingdom Fire Board. And he's just going to share, as we close up here, he's just going to share a few different ways that you can get involved in different kinds of ministries, not just with us, Breaking Free and I Hope. There's so many opportunities, but at the very least, we wanted to share this stuff with you guys so you can just be praying for what's going on around the world.